Alright, welcome back to another web development video where I show you how to make modern websites using CSS3, HTML5, and a little bit of JavaScript. And in this video I'm going to talk to you about how to actually code the Flexbox fallback. So maybe you've heard me reference it or you've seen it in other places that there's a way to write the code so that it degrades gracefully in browsers that don't support CSS Grid fully yet. And one way that we can do that, because Flexbox has such high support across all browsers on all platforms, we can actually use Flexbox to simulate a grid similar to CSS Grid, but CSS Grid actually gives us more control than Flexbox does when we're talking about two-dimensional grid layouts. But we can create a faux grid. We can create something that's similar to CSS Grid, but it's a little bit more cumbersome. So I know a lot of people learned how to make the Flexbox grid first, including me, but as soon as CSS Grid hit in the browsers, then it was all in for me. For CSS Grid, it's just so easy to create two-dimensional layouts that Flexbox feels cumbersome for that purpose. So I'm going to show you how. I'm going to code it and just show you how to do the CSS Grid grid. We have just 9 images here, and as always, taken from Unsplash. You can get source images from Unsplash, like a URL from source.unsplash.com. So you can just kind of grab a URL and pull in Unsplash images into a project that's connected to the web. And so that's what I'm doing here with just these keywords. So it's pulling in a different image every time it refreshes based on these keywords. It's doing a search. So it's pretty powerful API, like a low-level API that you can just put right into your website and pull in multiple images. So let's take a look at CSS Grid Layout. This is caniuse.com, and I'm looking at the CSS Grid, how it's being implemented across all the browsers, and you can see that here with Opera it's still not supported at all, and there's still some issues with Internet Explorer 11, which I know that at my company we are still coding and having to write for at least IE 11. So this is something I have to deal with most every day when I'm making websites and using CSS Grid in the real world. And right now we're at 86% usage, which is really good, but it's not everybody. And one way that we can offset that is by using the Flexbox fallback. There's also a polyfill out there that you can use. If you look in the resources section, there's a polyfill here on GitHub that you can use, and I don't know if there's any other resources here, but you could use that and plug it in, and it should help you to do cross-browser. It probably would go back farther than IE 11, but Flexbox is actually Flexbox is actually let's see. So here you can see that Flexbox is almost universally accepted. Mobile, desktop, doesn't matter. It's at 95% globally. So Flexbox is still something that can be used, and as long as you're using kind of a basic version of Flexbox, it's even supported largely by Internet Explorer 11. So that's why the Flexbox fallback has been a really good option at this point. So let's go ahead and just get into the code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the grid layout first, because the grid layout is going to be the default layout for most browsers. So 86%, most browsers are going to look at the grid layout, and they're going to actually parse the grid layout and put it out on the screen. So let's start first with we have our grid container. And then inside that we have all of these grid items, and these are your the children of the grid container. So first we just say grid container to display grid, and then that sets us up to be able to lay out the grid how we want. What I want is, since I have 9 images, I want these images to just be laid out 3 across. So you can do this multiple ways. So you can set your breakpoints early and just say, you know, at this breakpoint I want to do this, and at this breakpoint I want to do this. Sometimes I don't really know what I want to do. I've already figured this tutorial out beforehand, but sometimes I really don't know what I'm going to do first, so I'll just kind of, you know, pull it out to a bigger width and just do it at the big size. I know how to make it work at the small size, so it's not something I really need to work out. But as I get to the larger breakpoints, sometimes that's where I need to work things out a little bit more. So I would just say grid template columns. I like to start with the columns and set up the column structure. And I'm just going to do 3 across, which means I can use the repeat function. And so you just do repeat in the parentheses, and then inside that you say how many columns you want, and then a comma, and then how wide do you want each of those columns. So it's going to create 3 equal width columns at whatever width I want. I can use pixels like this, or I can use I don't know, I could use rem, or I could use m, or I can use viewport widths or viewport heights. So there's a lot of different values that we can put in here, but what I want to do is I want to say 1 FR for each. And when we use the fraction unit, that means it breaks it up into 3 columns, and then each of those columns is going to take up 1/3 of the space. So if there are 3, then each column will take up 1/3 of the space. If there are 5, then each column will take up 1/5 of the space. The 1 FR unit just says fill in all the available space. So whenever you have one column with a set width, and then you have a second column that says 1 FR, then that set width will be set, and then the rest will just fill in the space. So when we have 3 columns and 1 FR, that means it takes up all the available space across 3 columns. So that's exactly what we want. And so we have this nice responsive layout. It gets a little bit small right here. So that's an issue that we'll have to deal with. But at a large size, you can see it's really nice. And the other thing that I want to do is I want to add a gap between each of the photographs. And when we use the grid gap property, it sets an internal gap, but not the external outside of the grid gap. So you'll see it here when I say 1 rem, which is equal to 16 pixels in this browser. And so here we have a consistent gap between the rows and the columns. But again, it only creates a gap inside of your grid container. It doesn't actually create anything on the outside. If you wanted to also create space on the outside, you would have to say a margin of 1 rem, and then that would give you the space on the outside of the container. It's not what I want. I want it to go full width, so we're just going to stick with this for now. And now we need to, like I said, once you get down to like these smaller sizes, I actually want it to break down into 2 columns. And then as you get to an even smaller size, I want it to break down into just a single column. So the way I would do that normally is to just copy. And I'm just going to come down here and declare at media and min width of 900. I find that to be a pretty good breakpoint for most things. I don't need all this. I only want to change the column structure. I don't want to change anything else. All this and this are going to stay the same. So I want that to be 3 columns. I want it to be just like this once I get to 900 pixels. And then at 600 pixels, which is also a pretty good breakpoint, then I want it to be 2 columns. And so we can see here that when I get to 600 pixels, it breaks down to 2 columns. And each of those takes up all of the available space in the column because we have our FR unit. And then if we just keep going, it'll turn back to 3 because that's what we have initially before we get to 600 pixels. So we just come in here and we can just say 1FR. You don't necessarily have to do the repeat. I guess you could, but repeat is when you want to do, instead of writing it like this, which is how you would normally do the column structure, and then this would be, so this is repeat 2, 1FR. This is repeat 3, 1FR, and it's the exact same thing as if you use the repeat notation. It's just that the repeat is a little bit cleaner. So here we have our full grid. So we have a solid grid structure here, just stacked, and then we have 2 columns, and then we have 3 columns, and then that 3 columns will extend out. You could put a max width on here and a margin of auto and make it centered so that it doesn't continue to get bigger. But this is a basic how do we do the Flexbox fallback. So let's set all of this grid code. We're going to set it into what's called a feature query. So a feature query says at supports, and then inside of that, so it's a similar makeup here as our media query, but we say at supports, and then you give the property that you want to be able to support. So if the browser supports display of grid, then we want it to run this code. And this is one of the best ways to like gradually enhance your website or have a gradual graceful fallback. So you write basic vanilla code above it, and then if the browser supports whatever you want to do, and it can be any number of advanced CSS properties, if it supports it, then it'll run this code. If it doesn't support it, it's just going to skip over this and do the vanilla code first, and then it's going to go and run through the rest of the code. So if it supports display grid, then it will actually run this code. If it does not display grid, then it won't run the code. So there we go. And now we need to do the same thing, but we need to make it for our Flexbox. So we're going to use the same elements. We're going to look at the same elements, the grid container and the grid items. At this point with CSS Grid, we haven't even had to touch our grid items. But with Flexbox, we're going to have to manipulate them a little bit. So we say grid container, and this is going to be display flex. And you can see now that it's flexed all of our items. This is not what we want. We don't want 9 items across, because when you get down smaller, it's going to make them super small. I know from experience that you're going to want these to wrap. So there's a property called flex wrap of wrap, and the reason that it wraps everything is that these are still 100%, so we haven't set a width on these yet. So when I say flex wrap, it pushes it goes all the way to the edge and pushes the next one down, etc. So the way that we can fix that and get our initial structure, which we wanted to do the 3 across, we would say grid item, and we need to set a width for our grid item. So at this point, I'm just going to use viewport widths. I like viewport widths. You could use percentage if you wanted to. So at 30 viewport width, it doesn't quite get us all the way to the edge. If you did 33, it would get you pretty close. If you did 34, it would push you past. Okay, so it makes everything come down. So obviously 33.3 is going to get you the closest. It's 33.3333333, and it goes on forever, right? So it doesn't quite get you all the way to 100% if you do that. We're going to set it at 30, and I'll show you why in just a second, because we want to recreate we want to recreate the spacing in between. And the way that we would do that is we just set a margin on all of our elements. And I've kind of worked this out before, and again I'm going to use viewport widths. And we need to set this to 30. I'm sorry. Is that right? 30? Yeah, there we go. So if we set this, the width of each element to 30, and we set the margin of each element to 1.5, we get a similar sort of layout as we had with our grid container. So not exactly the same, obviously, but you're not going for exactly the same necessarily with the fallback. It's just that you want to provide a similar experience for the people who are not going to get this grid layout. So I'm going to tell you that right now it's going to be very difficult to completely recreate what you did with CSS Grid with Flexbox, but you can get pretty close, and this is pretty close. So in my mind, when I'm doing it, I just want to provide a similar experience, knowing that it's super difficult to recreate the exact experience that you're going to with CSS Grid. And again, we want this to degrade at breakpoints, so we want it to be 2 columns and then 1 column. So we would take this here, and you can set this at media and min width of 900 pixels, and then this is what we want to happen at 900 pixels wide. And so we can copy this again, and we can set this at the 600 pixel width. What we want is this to be 45 and let's get down to it here. So you can see we're getting pretty close again. You can test out these values and see if 46 works better. It's a little bit much. Maybe you don't want 1. Maybe you can manipulate some of these values to get it a little bit closer to the edge before it breaks off. So you can see that's getting us pretty close right there, right? But what happens is if you get everything too close, then as soon as you get down to it, you get some weird things happening, like right here, because we're getting a little bit too close to the edge. If we do 45 and this is 1.5, it tends to get us a more consistent breakpoint. You see that? So it's a little bit more consistent, even though you're leaving a little bit on the edge over here. So for the design types, you're probably going to have a hard time looking at that because you're going to notice it every time, because I notice it every time. But you're going to be able to still recreate, for the most part, what we had there with the 3 columns down to the 2 columns. And then when we get down here at that breakpoint, we just want it to be 100 viewport width. That's like saying 100%. Okay, so that's equivalent to 100%. I don't like the gap necessarily on the outside and everything. So what I would do with the margin is initially I would say only a margin on the bottom. So I'd say top 0, right 0, bottom 1.5, and then on the left side 0. So then you get a nice margin of 1.5. If you want to get rid of this last one, then you would just come in and say last child. Like if you want this to be no margin but flush up against the bottom of the viewport, you would say last child margin bottom of 0. And then it gets rid of the margin on the last of the children of this element, the grid items. So now you have just kind of that, we've recreated that internal gap without having to create the external gap. So that is how it works. So right now the Flexbox works. You can see at every viewpoint we're getting a similar action as we did with the display grid. And because I'm using Chrome, I'm just going to uncomment this grid, and you can see here that some things have taken place. So some things changed, and the reason they changed is because now it's reading this grid code. So we can see here that it's going to look a little bit different, and the reason it looks a little bit different is because the margin up here has been applied. This margin has been applied even to the grid code, so you got to kind of watch out for that a little bit. So if we come down here, we can say when the grid code runs, then the grid item margin is 0. I'm sorry. The margin is 0, and then we get our grid structure again. And we want the width. It's also taking on the width, so we want the width to just be auto. Okay. Because you see all these all these elements that we've done up here, they carry on and they cascade down through the CSS. So because we're not changing any of those down here, we're just changing the grid structure. We're not dealing with the width or the margin. Then we have to deal with the width and the margin at this point, so that we change those values and get the grid structure that we originally wanted. So now we don't have that the margin on the outside of the grid. We just have the grid gap in between. So that's how you would use the Flexbox fallback. And again, this will theoretically degrade gracefully for well, it should be okay on there. Let's look at Internet Explorer. So let's pull this up in IE. We'll see if it works. Oh. Alright, so that tells us here. Let's see. So Codepen is letting me know that it only works in the debug view. So let's take our debug view and let's see if that works here. Okay. So you can see now that it has all the space around here. So it's taking our Flexbox and it's not taking the CSS grid. I'm using IE 11. And so we're still getting the similar structure. And as we get out, it goes to 3 columns, 2 columns, and 1 column. So we're getting all of those elements that we set up for the Flexbox grid with our IE 11 implementation, and the Flexbox is working perfectly in IE 11 the way that we wanted to, and it's giving us a similar, although you can see it's not exactly the same. So we don't get that nice full width bleeding to the edge, but it's close enough that someone is going to get a very similar experience, whether they're looking at it with an older browser that does not support CSS Grid, and a newer browser that does support CSS Grid. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Hopefully I didn't go too fast and this all makes sense. What you want to do is make sure that you put your Flexbox fallback first, and then you put your grid support second, because the browser's gonna call all the Flexbox stuff first, and then if it supports CSS Grid, then it will override what it's done with the CSS Grid. And also don't forget to do clear out any styles that you did up here in order to make the Flexbox look right for your grid. Like I said, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. You can follow me on Twitter. You can send me a message on Twitter as well at Brian Hefferkamp. And also, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, I have lots of different types of videos, some CSS Grid, some Flexbox, some for a program called MobiRise, which would be great for like a small business or a small project. And so just go on there, check it out, subscribe, and you'll get notifications of all the new videos that I put out. And all right, that seems great. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.